The story of WSTA has been about commitment, collaboration, connectivity, and community. WSTA member companies are woven into the fabric of their communities, with their fiber networks and with their unwavering belief in rural Wisconsin. And this relationship has never been more important than right now. So much has changed in 2020, but our 110-year-old tradition of commitment to our customers and communities has remained steadfast and is at the foundation of moving forward into the future. 2020 will be remembered for two very different challenges presented to WSTA and our members. The first was a legislative challenge and success with a property tax exemption for our rural broadband investments. Working together, we secured the most significant legislative victory in years with 2019 Wisconsin Act 128. As a member-run association, it was an effort that began with our membership, discussing challenges and brainstorming ideas around the conference table. Partnering with Senator Howard Markline and Representative Romaine Quinn, we were able to transform a concept into a legislative proposal. We demonstrated the collective strength of our grassroots outreach, phone calls and emails to targeted lawmakers, and shared our compelling stories through public testimony before Senate and Assembly committees. Assembly Bill 344, co-authored by Senator Markline and Representative Quinn, is a perfect example of these positive partnerships and strong member engagement. AB 344 became Act 128 with the stroke of the governor's pen on March 3, 2020. But we know sound public policy does not just happen. Like all statutory change, it needs to be developed, championed, and strategically guided through the legislative process. Because of your commitment and collective effort, we are able to have a profound impact on public policy and the future of rural broadband investments. This legislative victory came just 2 weeks before the COVID-19 crisis brought our state to a place we've never been before. On March 25th, everything changed for our schools, students, businesses, customers, and communities. But as always, WSTA members rose to the occasion, and the collective response from our member companies has been humbling as we have been able to make a true impact on the forward direction of Wisconsin. Individually, our members were up to the challenge. We worked quickly and efficiently to connect students and telecommuters who were suddenly distance learners and remote workers. Collectively, every WSTA member endorsed FCC Chairman Pai's Keep Americans Connected pledge. We waived installation fees, overlooked account balances that were past due, opened public Wi-Fi hotspots throughout our communities, and proactively partnered with school districts to identify students in need.
As we look to the future, WSTA will continue to lead, collaborating with our elected officials, creating opportunities for broadband deployment, establishing innovative partnerships in our communities, and connecting our broadband to help customers lead better lives. This is our 110-year-old commitment, and one that we will never take lightly. Thank you for your work and tireless dedication to improving the lives of all Wisconsinites. It is an honor to work alongside you for a better tomorrow.
Good morning. I'm Tim Kuzlik and chairperson of the 2020 WSTA Fall Conference Committee, as well as general manager at NextGen Broadband. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 WSTA Fall Conference and Exhibits. I've been honored to serve as chair of the Fall Conference Committee this year, and I want to thank WSTA President Chad Young for asking me to serve to you in this capacity. I would also like to thank the members of the 2020 Fall Conference Committee and Associate Member Group Committee for their efforts. I am confident that you'll appreciate their hard work in putting together an outstanding virtual conference. The committee members are Dennis Bachman, Citizens Connected, Christy Berger, NTech, Jim Costello, Links Network, Jamie Lindsay, Solaris, Gene Paulk, TDS Telecom, Cheryl Rui, Tri-County Communications Co-op, Jerry Snyder, Marquette Adams Telephone Co-op, Chad Young, Norvado, Gene Utland, Cooperative Network Services, Eric Benson, Power and Tel, Kevin Klein, Vantage Point Solutions, Rory Trough, Repcom, and Jerry Weber, Innovative Systems. Let's also take a minute to recognize the associate members who provide support for the Fall Conference through sponsorship opportunities. Many of the annual partners have been great supporters of WSTA for more than a decade. Gold annual partners, Finley Engineering Company and Wind Technology. Silver annual partners, BKD, Interstate Telecom Consulting, and National Information Solutions Cooperative. Bronze annual partners, Badger Communications, JSI, Mid-America Computer Corporation, Midstate Consultants, Power and Tel, Siebert and Company, TCA, and Unitel Insurance. Bronze Fall Conference sponsor, Calix, and basic Fall Conference sponsors, Access Wisconsin, Metaswitch, and Olson Thielen CPAs. Thank you again. We just can't say enough to all of our sponsors and associate members. They do such a fantastic job supporting WSTA, especially our convention and fall conference. Let's also thank and recognize the virtual exhibitors. We encourage everyone to visit the exhibits during our online exhibit hours. The exhibit hours are this afternoon from 2 to 4, and again tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 4. The links for each of the virtual booths are emailed to all registrants. I want to take a moment to let everybody know that the Wisconsin State Telecommunications Foundation has awarded more than $1,690,000 to more than 1,330 students. Please remember to support WSTF. The foundation is here to help students pursue their dreams. We will be asking for your feedback through online surveys following our fall conference session. The online surveys, which will be emailed to you, are brief and will be topic specific for each program session. Most importantly, you will be eligible to win a Visa gift card for taking the online surveys. It is now my pleasure to welcome Chad Young, CEO of Norvado and the 2020-2021 WSTA President, with his President's Address.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to serve as your WSTA Board President. It is an honor to follow Christy Berger's successful year as WSTA President. With your support, we will work together to build on our achievements. As we saw in our opening video a few minutes ago, our strength is in our collective effort. And by working together, we will continue to create success for our companies, communities, and customers. Our recent legislative success with 2019 Wisconsin Act 128 was possible because of the combined contributions of individual member companies. We leveraged strong relationships with key lawmakers, shared our compelling stories, and complemented our direct lobbying. This strategic and comprehensive approach led to our success. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and increased broadband demand for telecommuters and distance learners also required an immediate, efficient, and thorough response. Customers with our broadband were fortunate to have our service prior to the pandemic and will be well served throughout the COVID-19 crisis. Moving forward together, we will continue to serve our customers, preserve and build on our legislative success, and deploy more cutting-edge broadband offerings in rural Wisconsin. We will expand student broadband access through partnerships with our local school districts, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and CISA Purchasing. We will work to maintain the telephone property tax exemptions included in recently enacted 2019 Wisconsin Act 128. We will explore opportunities to mitigate delays and improve our experience with Diggers Hotline locating. We will continue to partner with NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, on federal priorities and work to secure support from the Wisconsin Congressional Delegation. We may expand our discussions with electric cooperatives to create partnerships focused on using easements for broadband expansion. We can help solve our future workforce needs with the Broadband Service Technician Apprenticeship and the newly announced Broadband Technician Youth Apprenticeship. We will guide the statewide conversation on rural issues and broadband access with membership on Governor Evers' Blue Ribbon Commission on Rural Prosperity and the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access. Our success would not be possible without your collective efforts. Thank you for your contributions to that effort. Through your membership in the association, through your company contributions across Wisconsin, and through your individual leadership in our industry and in your communities. And thank you again for the opportunity to serve as your WSTA Board President. It is now my privilege to introduce today's first presenter. We are very pleased to have Sheldon Peterson with his presentation, The Fed, Markets, and Economy in a COVID-19 World. Sheldon has been Chief Executive Officer of National Rural Utilities Cooperative Finance Corporation, or CFC, since March 1995. He joined CFC in August 1983 as an area representative where he provided financial management and consulting services to members in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, and the Dakotas. In 1990, Sheldon moved to CFC headquarters where he held various management positions. Prior to CFC, Sheldon began his work in rural electrification with Nishnabotna Valley REC in Harlan, Iowa. In November 1980, he became general manager of Rock County ECA, now Rock Energy Cooperative in Janesville, Wisconsin. Sheldon serves as a director on the board of Homestead Funds, a family of publicly traded no-load mutual funds established in 1990 by the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. He is also on the NRTC board. A native of Western Iowa, he received his BA degree in marketing from the University of Northern Iowa in 1975. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sheldon Peterson.
Hello, my name is Sheldon Peterson. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a true pleasure to join your meeting in this fashion. Today, I've been asked to talk about the economy. RTFC through CFC is a publicly market issuer organization. We participate in the debt capital markets on a regular basis. And as such, the tracking of the economy is critical for our decision-making in placements in the capital markets if we're going to really truly be effective in this regard. As a result of that, what we do in terms of our work with the economy is directly affecting the business decisions we make here. But I want to also make you aware of the fact that it probably frames my perspective to some degree. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about the economy. I myself am a native Midwesterner, and I've chosen to name the current economic circumstances that we're in as a tornado economy. Quite frankly, it obviously came up pretty fast with very little warning, left a lot of damage in a short period of time, and it's going to take us a while to dig our way back out of this. Now, in finance terms, this is what's called a true black swan event. And a black swan event was something you first heard referenced in 2008 with regard to that financial problem. A black swan event, very simply, is something that has a very low likelihood of occurring, but a very high impact if it does in fact occur. And of course, the impact of the COVID situation was very fast and truly had a global impact immediately. And with 34 million cases in the globe and 1 million deaths, obviously very few have been left untouched in this area. Well, if we're going to talk about where we're going from here, let's just take a moment and talk about where we were before the COVID situation affected the economy so deeply. In January of 2020, we were in the 11th year of an economic growth cycle. Now, admittedly, it had been a fairly lethargic growth cycle. Nonetheless, we had gone an entire decade without a recession, and that's the first time that's ever happened. The economy was on track in 2020 to grow at about a 2.5% rate. Job creation since 2008 had been extraordinarily strong. In fact, at 7.9%, we're back in the levels that we last saw in 1969 prior to the most recent 2008 to 2020 improvement. If we were to talk about business concerns at that time, we probably would have talked about tariffs and the Chinese import-export situation. Now, the Federal Reserve from 2008 up until 2020 had gradually increased rates and then also taken a couple of rate cuts as they were working to try to get back to a neutral interest rate position. In other words, remove some of the stimulus that they put into the market back in 2008. One of the other things they wanted to do very simply was to build some dry powder so that if something did happen in the economy, they were able to lower interest rates to use this as a first defense. Now, 2019 was a fairly volatile year for some of the markets. However, from a stock market perspective, the Standard & Poor's 500 actually increased by 29% in that year. And that was driven largely by low inflation rates and low interest rates. On the whole, 2020 actually started out as a okay year. Now, that brings us to where we are today. And one question I get asked frequently in presentations like this is this the same as 2008? And the answer purely and simply is no. In fact, it's not even remotely close. What occurred in 2008 really was as a result of US financial market imbalances that were created by an excessively priced housing market, and then also some problems that the banking community was having, as well as some of the toxic securities that were developed in order to fund growth in the housing market. As a result of the 2008 issues, GDP dropped at most by 8.4% back then, and the unemployment rate actually moved up to about a 10% level. Now, the Congress, just like recently, did choose to put in some fiscal stimulus into the market, and they passed the $831 billion Resource Recovery Act. In 2008 through 2009, the Federal Reserve had the ability to lower short-term interest rates by roughly 5% or 500 basis points. And if we looked at the level of federal debt back then, it was just about $12 trillion. Now you move forward to 2020, and instead of being internally triggered, this is obviously an external fact that is affecting the economy with COVID-19, and it affected the global economy almost instantaneously. We've already seen one quarterly GDP collapse by about 33%, and we know that the unemployment rate at one point had peaked as high as 14.7%. Stimulus activity, a little bit different this time around. The Congress passed the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, but in addition to that, there are other levels of support that they added to the economy, in addition to what the Federal Reserve did. The Fed this time around, because they were still working off interest rate reductions from 2008, only had the ability to drop interest rates by 175 basis points, not 500. Another big difference between then and now is the fact that we started this year with $22 trillion worth of federal debt. Now, let's set the stage for the economic analysis. First of all, let's look at GDP growth. And this is globally here. And if you were to dial back to 2018, the economies around the globe were really growing in a somewhat similar fashion, and it was referred to as a synchronized growth. The 45 major economies that report to the OECD had all reported positive growth at that time. 2019 rolls around and things started to slow globally. In fact, 22 of the world's central banks actually reduced interest rates to provide stimulus. In fact, 2019 was referred to as slowbalization. Now, when we get to the beginning of 2020, this was supposed to be the year of the emerging markets. And the emerging markets and the rest of the economy were expecting about a 3% GDP growth in the economy globally. However, we find ourselves now in a synchronized recession that has affected nearly every major economy, perhaps not as much in China as others. China still reports just a slight positive number in their GDP growth for the year. That's if you can believe China's numbers. But what happens in China and what happens in the US are really important, because what happens here affects the world fairly significantly. The IMF is projecting that as a result of economic pullbacks in 2020, there's going to be about $12.5 trillion worth of lost output. So let's focus now just on the US GDP numbers. We started this back in roughly mid-March. There was an expectation that this would be the deepest and the shortest recession this country's ever had. And that was premised on the fact that there was an expectation of a quick resolution, and then the government spending did provide some cushion for the economy. So what we saw for 2020 so far was first quarter GDP dropping by 5%, a negative 5%, second quarter GDP dropping by roughly a negative 32%. Now, projections are, and there's every indication that in the third quarter numbers, we're going to see the economy bump back by almost 35% as people have adjusted to social distancing and wearing masks as alike, and state governments have become less restrictive in terms of business shutdown. Now, I mentioned the 35% number for the third quarter. That's not something that's sustainable long-term. In fact, the expectation is that for fourth quarter, we're likely to see a 4% growth. No question about the fact, this was in fact the deepest and shortest recession ever, but I'm not sure where we stand right now. That fact gives any solace to people that are still dealing with the struggles of the COVID situation. Let's talk a little bit about government stimulus. Again, the CARES Act input about $2.2 trillion into the fiscal stimulus. If we could have the next slide. And in addition to that, because of some emergency funding activity that they were able to do outside of the normal government budget, that added another $444 billion worth of stimulus. And then a relaxation of certain tax provisions added another $675 billion of stimulus. All totaled, that's roughly $3.3 trillion of stimulus, about 15% of GDP. That's the largest ever stimulus package this country has ever seen. Interestingly enough, there was also very good coordination with what the Federal Reserve was doing on its own with monetary policy to provide stimulus to the economy. However, the Federal Reserve has noted that the CARES Act and that additional stimulus obviously is starting to wear off. And the Federal Reserve has suggested to Congress it's time to look at additional fiscal stimulus beyond this point. Now, let's talk a little bit about the market impacts. I'm going to refer specifically to mid-March through mid-April. Everybody knows that the stock market took a wild correction in mid-March, but also saw a fairly significant recovery as well. What people probably weren't watching as closely, but we do because we do actively sell daily into the capital markets, was that the debt capital markets almost completely seized up. And quite frankly, that did look a lot like 2008. There was a shortage of liquidity in the market. We saw this in our case in commercial paper sales, which are short-term notes that are sold to investors. That market got very expensive. The maturities became very short. We never lost access to the market, but it did become more expensive for a while. But the investors were actually hoarding reserves because of uncertainty about what the future holds. And there were some companies that simply weren't able to get short-term capital, and that did in fact cause some distress. In fact, the Treasury Department itself, for a short period of time, even had difficulty clearing its own Treasury sales. Nothing would have stopped the economy globally in its tracks quicker than the lack of liquidity. Fortunately, liquidity in the market reoccurred very, very rapidly. There was a positive improvement. And for that, let's turn our attention to the Federal Reserve, which I will be perfectly honest with you, I was a critic of the Federal Reserve in terms of their actions from 2008 on. I thought back in 2008, they were very slow to act. It took them 17 separate reductions over the course of a year to get interest rates back down to zero. There was otherwise fairly modest intervention outside of interest rates. And that's why, in my view, we had to have several years of extremely low interest rates or emergency monetary policy, which was quite unlike anything we've ever seen before. But this graph, which shows you the Fed funds rate, which is the short-term bank rate for reserves among banks that they trade them among themselves, and is the benchmark that the Federal Reserve sets for short-term rates, you can see that it took them quite a while in January of 2007 out to basically April of 2009 to effectively reduce rates lower. They had been gradually increasing rates, a slight reduction in 2019. However, a substantially different thing happened in 2020. Under the Chairman Powell's leadership, the Fed this time around learned some lessons, and they were very, very fast to act. And they, again, actually lowered interest rates back to zero in the course of 1 month. They also developed multiple new programs to provide liquidity support to the marketplace across a broad spectrum of organizations and companies that were accessing the market. Quite frankly, the Fed saved the liquidity markets, and they saved them fairly quickly. But also that has a lot to do with why we've seen the stock market recovery. In fact, right now, from economic impact, it's all about the Federal Reserve today. And what the Fed did really was the difference between the globe entering a global recession as opposed to a global depression. And again, if I could go back to the interest rate slide, one more back. Again, this action here is representative of the short-term benchmark interest rates. I do want to point out, however, that it does influence longer-term interest rates as well. So this is a listing of the 16 different programs that the Federal Reserve did develop to provide liquidity to the market. It was amazing how quickly they were able to come to market with these programs. Now, I'll have to admit, a couple of them were redos of 2008, but it was only a couple of them. And they worked very aggressively to reflate the economy, provide liquidity in multiple sectors of the economy. And again, that's why stability returned so quickly. In fact, I can tell you from a bond issuer perspective, we've never seen the market so good in terms of the amount of money that's available for bond sales as well as the interest rate. Okay, we'll go ahead and start looking at some of the statistics. We'll first look at jobs. The economy lost more jobs through April than we had created in the prior 11 years, about 22 million jobs. And as we know, it did not affect all workers in exactly the same fashion. And how many jobs that are lost permanently is the big unknown that will also, again, have a lot of future impact on the economy. But this really is where stimulus is needed in terms of supporting the employment program. And as we speak here today, the Congress has not been successful in negotiating the next level of the stimulus package. Now, I will say we have gained back about half of the jobs that were lost through that April period, but there's a ways to go. In fact, if you look at the unemployment rate on the next slide, the September unemployment numbers came out at about 7.9%. That's the bottom line on this graph, which is the U3, which is the most commonly cited unemployment rate. The line above that is the U6, which is the underemployment rate, which includes things like people who are working part-time jobs, but really would rather have a full-time job. But it's easy to go back on this graph that starts in 1994 and compares what happened now with what happened back in the 2008 period. Quite frankly, we're probably looking at an 8 to 10% unemployment rate from now until probably well into 2021. That's important because that affects consumer spending, and consumer spending is about 70% of the economy. The other reason that's important is one of the first areas you look for inflation is in tightness in the labor markets, and we're a long ways from having tightness in the labor markets. Now, there's no question about that. We're in a bifurcated economy at this stage of the game. Besides the stock market doing very, very well, the housing market is also another unexpected bright spot in the economy. Quite frankly, in a recession, you typically expect the housing market to come under significant stress. That's not the case right now. And one of the reasons, of course, is very low interest rates. That's done a lot to improve affordability of housing. But the other trend we're seeing now is that people are looking for larger homes, perhaps looking to relocate out of the cities into the suburban or rural areas, largely because people expect to be working from home for quite a while yet, if not permanently going forward, and they're looking for more room to do that with, and they're spending more of their recreation time at home as well. What also helps this time around is, unlike in 2008, the banks as a whole are doing much, much better. They're in much better condition. And so also the consumer has a much better balance sheet now. The Mortgage Bankers Association actually has quoted that through June, we've actually seen about a 54% increase in mortgage applications. Having said that, we're also at a point right now where we have the highest mortgage delinquency rate that we've ever had. And again, it does illustrate the impact and the differential in the economy. So we just take a quick look at the stock market, and I am by no means an expert in the stock market, but I think it's always worthwhile to point out in talking about the economy that the stock market is not the economy. The stock market can be a barometer of economic expectations, but it is not a direct influence of what's happening in the economy. It's all about expectations. Two things are going on right now in the stock market. One is the fact that the pandemic has made very clear who some of the corporate winners are and who some of the corporate losers are. And clearly, the market increases have been skewed to those companies where people view that they're long-term winners. But the other point is the Federal Reserve, with their monetary policy, where they have run interest rates down to essentially zero, is they are pushing investors into a risk-on trade, moving people into the stock market because low interest rates actually help subsidize some of the higher price earnings multiples we see in the market. And quite frankly, there's a glut of liquidity out there to continue to support this as well. So, you know, a big part of what's happened in the stock market is because of the Fed. Now, again, I mentioned early on, this was expected to be the steepest and fastest resolved recession we've ever had. And to some degree, that is correct. And you heard a lot of discussion about a V-shaped economy. I'll be honest with you. The magnitude and the rate of change that we've seen in economic statistics in the first few months of this year have been so dramatic that a lot of the forecasting models really don't work right now. And so I can say that the expectation that we would have a V-shaped recovery really isn't on the table anymore. In fact, people also were talking about a W-shaped economy, which would be reflective of the reoccurrence of the coronavirus. It really looks right now that probably a more likely representation of this economy would be the reverse radical sign, or the square root sign, if you will, which would indicate the economy did in fact take a deep dive. It's going to come somewhat back and then kind of level off and be fairly uneven and gradual over a longer period of time. You've also heard folks talk about the possibility of a K-shaped recovery. And you have to lay the K on its side for a K-shaped recovery. But what they're referring to is that bifurcation in the economy, where there are some segments of the economy that aren't going to see much of any recovery, and then others are responding well because they have been able to adapt to the new operating environment. And this slide here really is just to show some of the things that we obviously all see out there in the economy, and that is the fact that it's been a economy that is in fact bifurcated. So as a result of that, middle income, high income, skilled workers tend to be doing just fine or better right now, as opposed to low income, unskilled workers, which are really feeling the brunt of the economic downturn. And that's really because things like manufacturing or knowledge workers have the ability to continue operating on. I know we've been able to operate our companies at full strength just by going remote. But that's as opposed to workers that are involved in the point of sale service area, or things that we're dependent on large crowds getting together in small places. Quite frankly, large business has a much greater capacity to weather the storm here than small business does. Small business typically has less capital available to tide them through the downturn. Most of them are locally dependent, and so specific areas of the country that are hardest hit, those are small businesses that are going to be hardest hit. And that's important because 80% of the jobs in the country are in small business. But I have recently seen one statistic that would indicate that by the end of 2021, the US will have seen a 57% increase in corporate insolvencies as opposed to where we were in 2019. And the sectors of the economy that are hardest hit are the obvious ones. I mean, we know housing's doing well, tech services are doing well, online shopping's doing fairly well. Even some retail, the traditional retail is doing fairly well also, but brick and mortar businesses are very hard hit. Travel, leisure, hospitality, sports venues, things of that nature, all pretty hard hit when we see other sectors of the economy doing quite well. Well, let's talk about GDP consensus going forward. So it's still dependent on several factors that are very uncertain. The infection rate, I think, is a big driver. In fact, I've said in some of my presentations that if you really want to track what goes on in the economy, track the infection rate, because that's really going to be what drives it. And of course, the time variable associated with vaccine production and acceptance. Quite frankly, another unknown factor is the consumer's willingness to return to the market. We did see some pretty nice improvement in consumer confidence here recently. However, I've also seen surveys about people's unwillingness to really get out there and engage in a lot of normal activities just simply because of concern about the virus. As yet unknown, if we do see a significant upturn in business insolvencies, what happens with all that capital destruction and what's the ongoing impact? And then the other unknown factor is Whether or not corporations will use some of the lessons they've learned now as people have had to completely change their business model to slim down costs for in the future. Does it mean lower employment by some organizations? Does it mean the fact that people actually will learn they don't need to rent office buildings like they have in the past? And of course, all that remains to be seen. But we can cite some indications of the GDP recovery. And again, this year we're likely looking from a GDP perspective at about a negative 4% number by the time you roll through all the deep reduction second curve and nice improvement in the third quarter. But overall, the expectation next year is roughly a 4% GDP growth. Positive as opposed to the 4% negative for 2020, and then maybe slightly less than that going forward. What does that mean for the labor market? Well, right now it appears, if you look at most forecasts, it is going to be somewhere between 2023 and 2026 before we ever effectively move from that 7.9% level that we're at right now back to the 3.5% level that we saw at the beginning of the year. And it is interesting, economist expectations are fairly close to Federal Reserve expectations right now, and that's not necessarily always the case. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, just simply because they are in the middle of what we've seen for a big part of the economic recovery and the relief, if you will, in the stock market and the debt capital markets. And it all goes to the Federal Reserve mindset on stimulus. Now, they have two primary tools that they use to manage monetary policy on a regular basis. One of them is that short-term interest rate, which they specifically set and target. That's the Fed funds rate. And the other, in recent years, has been quantitative easing. In other words, the Federal Reserve going into the bond market, buying government securities, buying mortgage-backed securities to take them out of the market, which in effect then pushes more cash into the economy, and at the same time leverages down a little bit longer-term interest rates. Important to note, the Fed doesn't directly control long-term interest rates, but they have tried to muscle them. Now, Congress has mandated to the Fed that they're to look at two primary categories in the development of monetary policy. One is price stability or inflation level, and the other one is unemployment or maximum employment. And over the years, they've always adjusted their targets, but these two have been the primary drivers of the Fed's monetary policy. And from 2008 to 2019, the Fed actually exceeded their minimum target for unemployment when the rate dropped to 3.5%. However, over that same period of time, they've really come up short in terms of trying to move inflation back to a 2% level. And the reason they are looking at 2% is because they just want to avoid deflation, and they're comfortable with a 2% inflation rate. Recently, the Federal Reserve changed its orientation of its policy. This summer, they came out and they indicated that they were going to change the way they judge their inflation target by adopting something called flexible average inflation targeting, which basically just means they're going to look at inflation over time. And they're going to allow, in cases where inflation is rising, inflation to run hot. In order to get back for over a period of time, something that looks like that 2% level. The net effect of this, quite frankly, is there's going to be much more focus on the Fed on trying to build inflation or reflation of the economy, if you will, and less attention paid to the jobs indicator that they're charged to look at. The likely net effect of all this, and the reason I bring this up, is that we're likely to see interest rates that are lower, longer, and that goes for just short-term rates, but also long-term rates. And this is really a policy that's been undertaken by other central banks like the Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank. Now, when looking at inflation, the Fed targets its policy based on the core personal consumption expenditure, which is not the CPI number that we typically see in the press. Core PCE means that they are taking out of this calculation food and fuel to reduce some of the volatility. And again, in recent years, they have been attempting to target a 2% inflation rate, just as other developed nations have been trying to do as well. They've not been successful in getting to those levels, and several reasons have been cited for this. Global economic integration, globalization, as companies have access to resources and employment that sometimes can circle a much broader geographic area, tends to drive prices down. Supply excesses in the economy, we're certainly seeing that now. Something called the Amazon effect, which greatly improves the consumer's ability for price discovery. We can quickly look and find the lowest price for a product. Now, working on the other side recently has been the devaluation of the US dollar currency relative to the euro, for instance. You're going to hear in the news a lot of speculation about increasing inflationary pressure as the economy improves. And I'm sure that is true for some selective products and services. But quite frankly, for the near term, maybe 2 to 3 years here on out, the higher likelihood is we're going to continue to see very low inflation rates. Well, let's look at interest rates going forward. This is a graph that takes the 10-year Treasury rate and plots it from 2018 up to current times. And as you can see, rates did rise after the 2008 crisis, but over time in the recent months, they've obviously gradually fallen and fallen and fallen. If you look at the things that drive long-term interest rates, part of it is the Federal Reserve short-term policy that does tend to anchor what happens in the interest rate market. But quite frankly, long-term interest rates are driven by inflation expectations and economic activity expectations, and to some degree what the Fed's done in their quantitative easing. A huge influence in recent years has been the amount of foreign money that has flowed into our debt capital markets to kind of take advantage of the US's better than typical GDP level, as well as a little bit higher interest rates here. All of those things kind of point to the fact that long-term interest rates are really driven by supply and demand. And there is virtually no upward pressure right now on longer-term interest rates. And so just as we expect the Fed to stay stable on short rates, we expect long-term rates to stay very, very low as well. And in making that prediction, I would say that this slide is representative of what's called the dot plot. And things have changed dramatically from what's represented on this slide. If you go back to 2019, this is the projected rate moves taken on a survey of all 17 members of the Federal Open Market Committee, which does set short-term rates. And as a general rule, there was a lot of diversity, and then they were projecting out diversity going forward. I can tell you for 2020 and 2021, and maybe a little longer, today, this dot plot just has one big dot right in the middle. The Federal Reserve simply does not intend to raise short-term rates for the next 2 and perhaps 3 years. In fact, Chairman Powell recently came out and indicated they were going to stay at 0 at least until 2023. Now, if I could have the next slide, and there's that dot plot that's just one big dot representing what's happening right now. Okay, to kind of tighten up on interest rates a little bit, it is interesting to know, and I'm sure you've observed, that stated interest rates in many of the other developed economies have been driven actually to negative rates by central bank policy. You're not likely to see that in the US. I think the Fed has indicated they're opposed to that. And quite frankly, the logic of these other central banks is if low rates are good, negative rates ought to be much, much better. And there's absolutely no statistical information available out there to support that, but they continue to pursue these policies. We're not likely to see that here. Quite frankly, we don't believe the Federal Reserve even has the authority to do that. However, if you look at real interest rates, which takes interest rates and nets out inflation, on a real basis, we do have negative interest rates here. And again, that's one of the reasons why I say that corporate America has never had it so good to work in the debt capital markets or just generally borrow markets. It's pretty tough, however, on fixed income investors, but it's also very helpful for the stock market. Well, kind of my last interest rate slide is if we take a look at the yield curve, and the yield curve can be a good predictive tool, but this simply plots right now the level of short-term rates as opposed to long-term rates. And that differential then is a pretty good indicator of what consumers are expecting longer term, or investors are expecting longer term when they buy bonds. And as you can see, the difference between, say, a two-year bond and say that benchmark 10-year bond is pretty tight, pretty small. And that's indicating that the markets do not expect rates to move very, very aggressively. They're expecting low inflation and modest economic growth. If it were something different, you'd see a much steeper curve that could be indicative of increasing rates going forward. Well, to kind of wrap all this up, I just want to mention a couple things that I think are important as we think longer term. Again, I mentioned earlier that $22 trillion was the level of federal debt at the beginning of this year. That actually exceeds 100% of our GDP. The growth in the deficits and the debt of the US government has been absolutely staggering this year, largely because of the stimulus that we were running. Interestingly enough, we actually have been running budget deficits for several years now, even though we weren't in a recession. And that was indirectly meant to continue to support economic recovery. But forecasts are right now that we're looking at a $27 trillion level of federal debt by the end of this year. You know, that's an obligation of future generations. But the fact that it's 100% of our GDP is also another important feature to consider. Countries like Japan, for instance, have been using this debt in excess of GDP model for quite some time. They've also obviously been using the negative interest rates here recently, and it's done virtually nothing for their economy. I mean, from a GDP growth perspective, Japan is a ghost town and has been for basically 20 plus years. But further than that, I can go back and cite for you studies that have looked at a couple hundred years worth of statistical data that compared sovereign debt of a country to its GDP growth potential. And there's a very clear correlation. Once a country hits 100% of GDP debt for their sovereign debt, that takes away about 0.5% or 1% of potential GDP growth. And while we don't think that's going to affect inflation or interest rates in the next 2 to 3 years, eventually that will start to affect interest rates as more and more of the Federal Reserve is crowding out other bond issuers in the marketplace, so that frankly issuers have to raise interest rates to attract capital because of the magnitude of the impact the federal government's having. Well, let's just wind this out by saying, now what? Well, again, history is no guide for us here. Longer term implications right now are very difficult to forecast. We do feel, however, that we can do some fairly reasonable projections in GDP growth and employment right now, pending any major changes in circumstances. Basically, again, we expect 2020 GDP to come in at a negative 4%, next year to come in at roughly a 4% increase, and then positive and slightly more gradual increase in future years. It's going to be very uneven and very bifurcated again. From an employment perspective, 2 to plus 3 years for us to recover back to the levels that we saw on January 1 of this year. The Federal Reserve has committed that they will do whatever, whenever, to continue boosting economic growth. The question becomes, what tools do they really have at this stage of the game? And they're certainly limited. And that's why the Federal Reserve expects Congress now to step in with fiscal support for the economy to kind of take off where the Fed left off. Bottom line, we see interest rates low for a longer period of time. Now, there are going to be repercussions of the nature of this significant change in our economy. The spread between income and wealth variance between certain sectors of the population is going to continue to widen. Again, it's a big unknown as far as how consumer confidence will readjust as we continue to learn to live with the coronavirus, waiting out for a vaccine. Deglobalization is clearly a factor that companies will have learned some lessons about where they place their manufacturing capability. And we're likely to see more movement of corporate America moving back to US soil, frankly, just from an economic security perspective more than anything. Trends to look for, how many business models are going to change because of efficiencies that the businesses have learned because of the rapid changes that we've had to incorporate in the way we do business. How much is the work at home phenomenon going to be permanent going forward? Has a huge impact again on things like real estate. Obviously, we're going to see significant additional expenditures in the IT area. Broadband is never more important than it is today. Pardon me. I recently had a discussion with one of the foremost economists in the country, Mohammed El-Arian, and we were talking about future implications of what we've just seen in the economy. And he expresses a point that we're likely to see a generational return of the Depression era mindset as it relates to saving money and spending. I understand what that means because my parents were Depression era kids, and they were very conservative in how they spent money, very conservative how they invested. And Mohammed's opinion is that between 2008 and 2020, the kids that are coming of age in this period of time likely could become just as conservative as they were, and that could have an influence on future economic growth. So with that, that's kind of where we see things going forward for the time being. I want to tell you how much I have enjoyed having the opportunity to make this presentation, and I look forward to having the opportunity to chat with you about some of your questions going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheldon. We're now going to take questions from the audience. To our audience members, you can either type your question using the Q&A feature on the Zoom screen or click the raise your hand icon. If you raise your hand, you will be unmuted to ask your question. So I'm going to start with a question, Sheldon. So you mentioned that the jobless benefits were the new stimulus, are where the new stimulus should be targeted. That's different than the CARES Act. Why do you say that?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Good to see you. The CARES Act certainly included a component that boosted unemployment payments for a while. But if you kind of look at the Total CARES Act, it was really targeted to bridging corporations and business through what was expected to be a relatively short downturn period. Then if you add to that the incredible stimulus from the Federal Reserve, when the Fed developed several of their new programs, they basically moved into, I'll call it lending or credit support for Main Street businesses and other corporate bonds. And that's really new to them. They haven't done that before, but that's added a lot of corporate risk to the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Putting all that together, it's starting to become clear, and Chairman Powell has certainly reinforced this point, that new stimulus is needed. However, this is obviously an economy that's not going to just bounce right back. It's an economy where we're clearly seeing who some of the winners are and who some of the losers are. And as the Fed has taken on this additional risk, I think it's starting to be very clear that ultimately there's a risk there that they're going to be bridging or extending the life of companies that probably are already beyond saving. Some people call it zombie corporations. And if that's the case, then probably since we don't have a clear view of when the economy will really robustly return, it's probably worthwhile to go ahead and let those companies that really aren't going to be available for the long term to go ahead and liquidate. But what that means, though, is we're still exposing a significant amount of the US population to unemployment. And it's probably best to direct the government resources that we have more to the individuals that are unemployed right now. That's a big driver behind consumer spending all the way, but it's also just kind of in my view, a better use of the government resources.
So do you have a sense of how the job losses so far are permanent?
Yeah, right now what the estimates are that for about 40% of the employees who have earned $40,000 a year or less, about 40% of those jobs have been permanently lost. And again, we're going to see the economy reconfigure itself in the employment area as well as we see the lasting impact of the COVID situation. And frankly, the longer the unemployment levels that exist right now go on, and the longer we see suppressed economic activity going forward, the more that number is going to move higher than the 40%. And I think it's probably worthwhile saying that, this is not a US only phenomenon. This is something that is being seen by many of the developed nations around the globe.
All right, so a little different. So how does dollar currency exchange rate affect inflation?
Yeah, it really has a fairly distinct impact. And we've seen the dollar lose some of its value relative to the euro, as an example here, since about May, as currency investors start to rebalance their portfolios. But the reality is that when the dollar declines in value relative to other currencies, that means that the things we buy on the import basis then are going to take more of our currency to meet the pricing. In other words, the prices go up for things that we import. On the converse of that, if a dollar value does decline, that tends to lower the cost of our items to foreign purchasers, but we're getting less revenue for the things that we're actually sending. So typically what happens is when the dollar falls, that tends to be inflationary. When the dollar rises, that tends to be deflationary. The bottom line overall is that we've seen the dollar lose some of its value. It's probably because of zero interest rates. It's probably because of an expectation of lower than optimum GDP levels. It's going to be part of our inflation picture on a going forward basis. You know, typically what you see is most governments do try to devalue their currencies when they're looking to recover because they want the boost that comes from increased exports because of lower export prices.
All right, so I got a question here. You had mentioned that manufacturing will head back to US. Will that be light manufacturing or include heavy manufacturing?
I think it's too early to tell on that. I think it's going to be mostly focused on those organizations, those companies that can't afford to have their supply chain disrupted. In addition to seeing some companies move manufacturing back to the US, and I think pharmaceuticals is a classic example of where we're going to see that big part of that activity. We also, however, do see manufacturing that US companies have been doing in China, as an example, move to other Asian countries as well. It's going to be a mixed bag, and it's really too early to tell. But clearly, there's going to be a refocus going forward because of some of the lessons that have been learned in terms of the manufacturing in foreign lands, put it that way.
Okay. So I got another one here. Any thoughts on whether large infrastructure deployments like major fiber broadband builds are a good idea for small rural providers, since they are generally dependent on customers who may be impacted by the disruption of COVID on their places of work?
Okay, I guess I'm going to let my rural root shine here, and the fact that I've worked in an organization for, well, several organizations for 45 years now that are focused on serving rural America. I think is a very good investment. One of the sad parts of the stimulus money that we've seen so far is it's really going to bridge, income levels, if you will, with not much of it being spent on infrastructure. I think we are possibly looking at significant realignment in how people work. I think rural America is, very rich in labor resources that could be better utilized. And I think things like fiber deployment in the rural area just makes good common sense for the economy overall. And I think it's reflective of what the world's going to look like going forward.
Well, I think that's pretty good news for everybody on this WebEx anyway, but interesting. So I got one more question here. If foreign central banks are using negative interest rates to boost their economy, why doesn't the US do that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I did mention negative interest rates in my presentation. And what I'm referring to in the US is stated interest rates that are not negative yet. In some foreign countries, the ECB, Japan for several years, the UK, you've seen central banks actually drive their stated rates into negative territory. The logic there is, again, if zero interest rates are good, negative must be even better. And the whole idea is to use central bank policy to kind of force people to spend more money and certainly save less money, because with negative interest rates, you get back less money than you invested if you buy a treasury security. Some countries are doing that also, to touch on something we discussed just a moment ago, and that's trying to drive their currency levels down in terms of the valuation. The reality is, in this country, our opinion is here that the Fed does not have the authority to do that here. Fed Chairman Powell has indicated he's not really interested in going that way. The reality is, in this country, we have what's called a fractional reserve banking system. That's just not built for negative interest rates here. Negative interest rates tend to skew pricing and risk asset valuations. It's very challenging for the business models for things like pension funds and insurance companies and the like. And quite frankly, it's very painful for people who are relying on fixed income investments to, say, fund retirement. You know, it's pretty hard to hang on to your retirement resources if you're investing in bonds that have a negative return on them. So overall, I think it's fair to say that the Fed has been very creative in some of their stimulus approach. Negative interest rates are probably not on the table. However, as I mentioned, when you net out inflation right now, 16 basis points for a 2-year investment right now certainly isn't a positive return, but at least the Fed is not directly pushing rates negative. And looking at a country like Japan, for instance, they've been using that tool for years. There's virtually no evidence whatsoever it's been helpful. And as somebody that's not too far from retirement and looking at having fixed income play a key role in my income going forward, I'm not in favor of it either.
All right, very good. So it looks like that's all we have for questions. So thank you again for being with us today, Sheldon.
Well, thank you very much, and my best to all the folks in Wisconsin. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you at this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next presenter is Joe Tai with Building and Sustaining a Culture of Ownership in Challenging Times. Joe is the founder and head coach of Value Coach, which provides consulting, training, and coaching on values-based leadership and cultural transformation. Joe earned a master's degree in hospital administration from the University of Iowa and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He is the author or co-author of 15 books on personal success and organizational effectiveness. Prior to founding Values Coach in 1994, he was chief operating officer for a large community teaching hospital. Joe and his wife Sally have 2 adult children, and they live on a small farmstead in Iowa. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joe Tai.
Hi there, I'm Joe Tai from Values Coach, and it's a pleasure to be back with the Wisconsin State Telecommunications Association. An awful lot has changed since the last time I was with you all 6 years ago in 2014. In fact, an awful lot has changed just in the last 6 months. And I want to start by talking about what I consider to be the ultimate paradox of life. And that is this: whatever you most need is hardest to find when you most need it. The time is never right when the timing is, and vice versa. When you really need something, the timing is never right. Let me give you a few examples. It is easy to be motivated when everything's going great, isn't it? Your job's going well, you just got a pay raise, the kids are happy and healthy, you're about to go on vacation. You are motivated. It is also irrelevant. Things are already going well. Your motivation doesn't make a difference. It's when things are falling apart. You've lost the job. The kids are in trouble. Your health is struggling. That's when you want to crawl under the bed and pull in the door behind you. That is when it is most important for you to find the motivation. That is also, by the way, when a little bit of motivation has the greatest leverage. Anybody who's ever lost a job and said, this sucks, then gone on to start a business and been successful will tell you that motivation was most important then. It is easy to have integrity when there's no temptation. It's when telling a little lie or cutting a little corner would be to your benefit that it's hardest to have that integrity and draw the line. It is easy to have courage when your fears are small. It's when they're nightmarish, giant fears. That's when it is hardest for you to find the courage. That's when it's most important. It is easy to persevere when you're hitting little speed bumps. It's when you hit that brick wall that it's most important that you plow your way through it. It's also when it's hardest. It's easy to be of service to other people when you have everything you need yourself. It's when you're struggling on your end that it's hardest for you to reach out and help other people. But I like to say whatever you most need in life, the best way for you to get it is to help somebody else get it who needs it more than you do. And by definition, that means you don't have everything you already need. This principle also applies at a culture level for your organization. Retired Admiral Eric Olson said this, talking about in the current issue of McKinsey Quarterly, talking about the war on coronavirus. He said, you must not sacrifice culture even in a crisis. A culture left untended is going to go someplace you don't want it to go. And once it goes there, it's really hard for you to get it back. And I'm really concerned because we are hearing from people that the three words I hear most often when I ask, how are your people doing? They are exhausted, they're anxious, and they are frustrated. And the one thing I'm hearing from so many organizations is, yeah, we're cutting back on training, we're cutting back on leadership development, we're cutting back on things that relate to culture. And here's what I'm most worried about. As a history buff, I've read a lot about World War I. In August of 1914, the troops went to war. They were almost all volunteers. The bands were playing. The pretty girls were throwing flowers. Their leader said, we're going to be home by Christmas, which they weren't. In November of 1918, this is how they came back. There were no bands playing, no pretty girls throwing flowers, no celebration. Most of these men had been drafted. And my worry is with everything going on, coronavirus, the economic challenges, the polarization in our society, if we don't tend to the culture of our organizations, we could end up like this. We could end up having those cultures go someplace we don't want them to go and being very challenged to try to get them back. And at Values Coach, we have three guiding insights behind our work in working with partner organizations. Number one, most important, we talk about changing culture. Culture does not change unless and until people change. Culture is shaped by the collective attitudes and behaviors of the people who work there. And if nobody's willing to change, if everybody's doing this thing, yeah, we got to change our culture, but it's not me. Yeah, we got to hold people accountable. Not me, I'm accountable, it's everybody else. Until enough people look in the mirror and say, if we're going to have a culture of ownership, if we're going to have the kind of culture we're proud to have, I need to be a part of that. I need to change my attitude. I need to change my behavior. I need to be more aware of my impact on other people. Until enough people do that, you can have motivational speakers, give everybody a book, everybody a happy face pin, but culture's not going to change. But change is hard. And the second guiding insight behind our work is this: people will not change unless you give them a new approach, give them some new tools, inspire them to use those new tools. We have all tried to change and failed, haven't we? New Year's resolutions show up dead on arrival. This is the year I'm going to fill in the blank. Lose weight, get out of debt, write a book, go to graduate school, start a business. And a year comes and goes and we haven't done anything. And so we put it on the list for next year. And you know the definition of insanity: doing the same thing over and over and expecting somehow a different outcome. So our guiding insight number three is this: the best way to help somebody be a better employee is to help them be a better human being, a better parent, a better citizen. The late great Zig Ziglar said, everybody listens to the same radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And you've got to remember that WIIFM factor. If you really want to change your culture, you have to help people understand the personal benefit of being a part of that change. So a hospital in Nebraska we worked with for a long time. And I got a letter from the CEO. He said, I got a whole new team and didn't have to change the people because they changed themselves. And I have come to see that as the gold standard of culture change. When enough people make that personal commitment to be part of a better culture, the culture will change permanently in a positive way. Now, Paul tragically passed away from a rare form of brain cancer. The new CEO came in, and about a year into the job, he wrote a full-page article in the hospital newsletter, and he said basically this: I came in thinking I was going to change the culture changed me. When you have a powerful, positive culture, it should transcend one individual, one job title, even if it's the CEO. So because I'm going to cover a lot of things very quickly, and because culture doesn't change unless and until people change, I've given you 3 take-homes. First is our Cultural Blueprinting Toolkit workbook. And there are a lot of tools and exercises to help you create a cultural blueprint for what we call the invisible architecture of your organization. I'll talk a little bit about that. Second, I've given you the workbook, Everyday Courage for Extraordinary Times. You're welcome to share this with anybody where you work or at home. And the truth is, we are in very challenging times right now. And we need to help people have that everyday courage to get up every day and do what they have to do. And the third thing is there's a link to our Values Trainer website. This is a website we maintain for all of our values coaches. Lots of resources there. The most important one for this purpose is called Pledge Power, and it's a 21 video module course on the Self-Empowerment Pledge. I'll mention that briefly. It's also described more fully in the handout. There's no charge for any of this. You're welcome to share it with anybody in any way that would be helpful. So let's move on. Have you seen the video, United Breaks Guitars? It's on YouTube. You ought to watch it. For one thing, it's very funny. This man is Dave Carroll. He is the lead singer for a band from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And they were on their way to play a concert in Nebraska. Airplane stops at O'Hare in Chicago. He looks out the window and he sees the baggage handlers mishandling their musical equipment. He goes running up to the flight attendant. "Ma'am, that stuff is fragile. Would you ask them to be careful?" And she says, "Sorry, I don't do bags. That's not my job." They get to Omaha. He opens a case of his Taylor guitar and it's been broken, $1,200 worth of damage. He writes United, "You broke my guitar. You owe me $1,200. They give him the runaround for 9 months. Finally, he gets the final no from United and he says, "Fine. If you don't reimburse me for the guitar you broke, I'm going to write a song about you." He warned them and they said, "Well, you go right ahead." As of the last time I checked, 35,472,692 people have viewed United Breaks Guitars volumes 1, 2, and 3. More than 140,000 people have rated it an average of 5 out of 5 stars on YouTube. And more than 50,000 people have posted comments, almost all of which are some variation of United sucks. The Taylor Guitar Company made their own video. How to pack up your Taylor guitar so United won't break it. Millions of people have seen that one. This is already being taught in business schools as an example, a case study of how not to do customer service. And just when you start to think, well, maybe United has learned their lesson, what do? A 69-year-old physician is sitting on the airplane seat that he is paid for because he's going home. They tell him, "We need to get you off the plane. We have a higher priority passenger." And he says, "No, I'm not leaving. I bought this seat." They send on a SWAT team, beat him up, break his nose, drag him out by his arms as everybody else is videotaping the thing. And you start to see things like this, the United Special Seating and Apparel Division, and cartoons like this, and things like this. "Buy your exit ticket on United. We'll take it from there." And things like this.
"We're going on a trip to Disney World. And we're flying United Airlines."
And what would it have taken to prevent any one of these customer service catastrophes from happening? One United employee caring. One person thinking like an owner. If one person had said to Dave Carroll, "Dave, I'm going to make it my mission to get you reimbursed for that guitar," he never would have done the song. If one pilot had come out and said, "SWAT team, what are you doing here?" "Oh, no, you turn around and go back," they would have gone back. If one flight attendant had looked down at a colleague and said, "What are you doing putting a dog in the overhead?" "No, you don't. We don't do that on you," and the dog died. If one person had thought like an owner, none of these things would have happened. And you know who the real losers are in this picture? All the fine men and women who work at United, because they have all been painted with this brush that says you don't care. and it's not true, and it's not fair. Anybody who flies United knows if you're nice to them first, they're always nice to you, and they usually get you where you want to go. And that gets me to this notion of invisible architecture. When you build a building, you hire architects, you hire designers, you have people out in the parking lot with masking tape, taping out rooms to make sure everything's going to work. And then you move in culture without any real thought, what we call the invisible architecture. And when it comes to the employee experience, the customer experience, your bottom line, the invisible architecture is far more important than the design of the bricks and the mortar. We call it the blueprint behind the blueprint. And in many ways, it's the soul of your organization, the way bricks and mortar are the body. Now, when you build a building, you build it in 3 stages. You put down a foundation, you put up a superstructure, you come in and finish it off with carpeting and wallpaper. And we use that as a metaphor, where the foundation is core values. You should have a statement of core values that defines who you are, what you stand for, and what you won't stand for. Now, many organizations have them, and they're a plaque on the wall, and it's, boilerplate, and it's the kind of typical stuff. It doesn't do anything to differentiate you from anybody else, but a great statement of values will do that. Mark Benioff, the founder of Salesforce, in his book Trailblazer, that's what he said. A culture rooted in values creates value, and we've seen it over and over. I'll give you an example. I was at an airport once. I had an hour between flights, so I went to the bookstore to get an energy bar. They had 2 kinds, Power Bar, Cliff Bar. I had time. I went back to the waiting area, typed in core values, Power Bar, core values, Cliff Bar. I get to Power Bar and I click on About Us, and it's all about us. We are Power Bar. We are great. We are the leaders. You're going to love us. I went to Cliff Bar and it said, we have aspirations, not values. And they have 6 of them and a different kind of bottom line. We want to sustain our business, but we also want to sustain our people and our communities and our planet. You click on each one of those boxes and it takes you to a comprehensive list of all the things they're doing. I bought a Cliff Bar. I continue to buy Cliff Bars. I happen to like Power Bars better, but I buy Cliff Bars because I like who they are. I like what their values are. They're much closer to the values that I aspire to. So here are 5 of my very favorite statements of core values, and we've read hundreds of them. High-tech company called Integrated DNA Technologies. One of their 8 core values, be yourself unless you're a jerk. Wouldn't you love to work for a company that had that philosophy and that sense of humor? ClickStop, they sell truck parts online. One of their 6 core values, expect greatness in yourself and inspire it in others. Data Robot, an artificial intelligence company in Boston, build sincere friendships and relationships even when it's hard, even when people are having to wear face masks and socially distance and we're starting to lose this sort of friendly fellowship. That's when it's hardest, but that's when it's most important to do. Of course, Zappos create fun and a little weirdness. And Cypress Semiconductor in the Silicon Valley, where the stereotype culture is laid back. Yeah, bring your puppy to work. Yeah, we're going to have a beer bash on Friday. Not at Cypress Semiconductor. They call themselves the Marine Corps of Silicon Valley. Their CEO wrote a book called No Excuses Management. And one of their core values, Cypress, is about winning. We do not tolerate losing. Now, I would not be happy working in that kind of environment. But they never make hiring mistakes. Who would apply for a job at the Marine Corps of Silicon Valley where they don't tolerate losing and you better not make excuses, who didn't think they had the toughness to work there? And when you're so clear about who you are, you can make a statement like this, you will not make hiring mistakes either, and you'll keep the people that you want to keep. Now, on that foundation of core values, the superstructure, back to our construction metaphor, is culture. Culture is the personality, it's the character of the organization. The best organizations have a personality, a character that suffuses the whole organization. We work with a lot of them where it depends on what department you're in, what day of the week it is, who is supervising today. The culture just sort of shifts. They're not clear about what they want that culture to be. Costco and Walmart, for example, they're in the same business. They hire the same kind of people to sell the same kind of products to the same target market. But the experience of shopping or being a customer at Walmart is very different than it is at Costco. A couple of years ago, Business Week ran a cover story on Costco. And on the cover, they said, ecstatic employees. I don't know about you, but I have never heard Walmart accused of having ecstatic employees. United and Southwest Airlines, they're in the same business. They buy the same planes from Boeing, recruit the same kind of categories of people to fly and maintain and service those planes. But if you've ever flown the two of them, you know, the experience of flying Southwest is a very different experience than the experience of flying United. When United got into all the trouble they came up with a new statement of values. One critic called them bumper sticker values, which is all they were. Southwest has 3 core values: warrior spirit, servant's heart, fun-loving attitude. Anyone who's ever competed against Southwest Airlines knows you're going to lose because that warrior spirit. Anyone who's ever flown with them knows you're going to have fun. They're going to try to make you have fun. And anybody who works there knows our #1 expectation of you is you're going to be a servant to the people we serve. And those values shine through in the culture, in the personality, in the character of the organization. Now, like a lot of people, I get bombarded with these offers from Xfinity, from Comcast, from all these people who want me to change my internet provider. I won't do it. I love South Slope. They're our local provider. I don't know what their technology is. I don't know if I could get better service from anybody else, but I love the culture at South Slope. I love the way they treat me. I love when I call them up. Even if I've never met them, they make me feel like I'm an old friend, like we're old friends. Why would I go to somebody else because it's a little cheaper or a little faster? And the answer is I wouldn't. Culture, when you get it right, becomes an incredible source of competitive advantage for you. And then back to our construction metaphor, the interior finish is attitude in the workplace. How do we treat each other? How do we talk to each other when we're talking to them? Or do we talk about them behind their back? These two people have the same job, don't they? What's different? Attitude. Who do you think is happier? Dances with mops or moping with mop? Who would you rather work with? Someone who dances or someone who mopes? Who would you rather live with? And who would you rather be like yourself? The most important decision we make, and we make it every day. In fact, we make it many, many times a day. What's your attitude? Something happens to you. What's your attitude? Someone says something to you. What's your attitude? Far more important than what actually happens or what is actually said is how you respond to it. And that is shaped by the attitude you choose to have. And I use that word deliberately. There is no attitude gene. It is a choice. It is a habit, pure and simple. I took this picture at the Atlanta airport a while back. Southwest Airlines advertisement at the train station says all airline employees have attitudes. Ours just have the good kind. They are using their reputation for positive attitudes to create a competitive advantage against Delta and American and United and all the others. And so I'll often ask, if I'm speaking with an audience, what would happen if United Airlines ran that exact same ad? And I once had somebody say, somebody would paint a mustache on the flight attendant. I said, really, who would do that? Somebody else said, another United employee. And it's probably true. I mentioned United Breaks Guitars. Well, Dave Carroll also wrote a book, same title, United Breaks Guitars. One of the things he said in that book is, for all the emails and letters I got from United customers who were unhappy, I got even more from United employees saying, you think it's bad flying with us, you should try working with us. That is culture being reflected in bad attitudes that are being picked up by employees and by your customers. And over time, attitude in your workplace will be defined and determined by what you say you expect and what you tolerate, and what you tolerate will dominate over what you say you expect. You say we expect integrity, but your culture tolerates two people in the break room talking about a coworker behind that person's back, and you have lowered your bar about what you mean by integrity. Unfortunately, companies that study employee engagement like Gallup, Press Ganey, my company, pretty much find the same thing. In the average organization, only about 25% of people are highly engaged. 60% are not engaged. Now, that doesn't mean they're doing a bad job necessarily, but all they're doing is the job, and at quitting time, they're out of there, and they're not going to be cheering for your company when they're outside of work. It's not my job. I'm not on duty. And in the average company, 15% of people are aggressively, toxically disengaged. They're the emotional vampires. Now, there's a huge range. We have worked with companies where everybody's engaged top to bottom. We've worked with companies where it feels like nobody is. We've worked with organizations where one department, everybody is, and 3 doors down, nobody is. The question is, what's your engagement level and what are you doing to improve it? Jim Clifton, the CEO of Gallup, wrote a book, The Coming Jobs War. You think it's been hard in the past to recruit, it's going to get even harder. And what he said in that book is disengaged employees, especially if they're managers, are a quality defect. Just like sending the wrong product out to a customer is a quality defect. Allowing someone to come in, work sucks, then you die, and infect your organization with that kind of attitude, that is tolerating a quality defect. So we do a lot of work with hospitals where we do our culture assessment survey. And one of the questions, in fact, the most important question in my view says this: our culture does not tolerate bullying, toxic negativity, or disrespectful behavior on a 5-point scale. These are 2 big medical centers in the same urban area. They compete for the same employees, the same patients, the same donors. And we did the survey within the same year. Hospital number 1, 8 out of 10 people either strongly agreed, almost half of them, or agreed. 8 out of 10 agreed with that statement. In the other hospital, 7 out of 10 did not agree, and almost nobody strongly agreed. So tell me, which hospital do you think has higher patient satisfaction? And it's 1. Which one has greater employee loyalty? And it's 1. Which one has higher nursing turnover? A huge problem, a very costly problem? 2. Which one has healthier financials? 1. Which one's had the most bad press? 2. See, just by knowing that question, the responses to that question, I can predict customer satisfaction. I can predict employee engagement, employee loyalty. I can predict financial performance. I can predict image in the community. That is the power of values, culture, attitude in the workplace. Now, we did a survey with you guys, had 18 people respond, and the responses were very, very positive. I wish I could say the same thing about many of the hospitals we worked with. 11 of you strongly agreed that your culture does not tolerate those behaviors, and the rest of you agreed nobody was unsure or disagreed. And that's wonderful. I would challenge you to look in the mirror and make sure you're not wearing rose-colored glasses. Make sure that everybody where you work would say the same thing, or if it's just, you putting on the rose-colored glasses and saying, yeah, we're great. If this is accurate, that's wonderful. If it's not, you need to be candid and honest with yourself about it. So let's shift gears. Remember what I said, culture does not change unless and until people change. So let's take a few minutes and talk about what are some of the ways you can help people change, because there's an invisible barrier on the performance potential of your organization, and that is what goes on in the minds and the hearts and the souls of individual employees who work there. And I love this bumper sticker. I used to have superhuman powers, but my therapist took them all away. And isn't that what happens to us? You may have seen this picture on the internet. It's become a meme. Tabby cat looking in the mirror and seeing the lion look back, which raises a really good question. Who could you be and what goals could you achieve if you didn't let fear stop you from achieving those goals, being that person? If you lived your values more effectively. Unfortunately, for many of us, it's the other way around. We are the lion and we look in the mirror and pretend to see a tabby cat. Oh, I can't do that. Oh, I wouldn't do that. Or I'm not going to ask for that. And the challenge is how do we reverse that picture to where it should be? So I'm going to share with you a couple of strategies. Strategy number 1, make the pickle pledge a part of your life, a part of your organization. This simple promise, if you take it, will change your life. And if all of your colleagues take it, it will transform your organization. It's in the handout, so I'm going to go through it quickly. I've taken the pickle pledge. I will turn every complaint, my head is killing me, into a blessing. Thank God for modern pharmacology. Or a constructive suggestion. The first symptom of dehydration is a headache. I should drink some water. There's nothing you can complain about that you cannot find something to be thankful for and something you can do about it. And what this does is you replace resentment, and anytime you're complaining, that's really what you're doing. You're saying, I resent something, with gratitude. You're replacing learned helplessness. You wouldn't be complaining if you thought you could do something about it, with initiative. And you're replacing self-centeredness. And anytime you're complaining, it's about me, poor me, wah, 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 with compassion for other people. And often if you're complaining, you're pointing a finger at somebody who's got a problem that you perhaps could help with. And we are seeing people do some really fun things. There's a hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, where they declared the place to be a pickle-free zone. I don't want to hear your whining and complaining. Take it to HR. They get paid to hear it. This is a hospital in New Orleans, Children's Hospital, where they have a parade through the hospital every day. They're still doing it now. They wear masks and they distance. And they have a cart where they give out pickles. Have a pickle, don't be a pickle. By the way, we call it the pickle challenge, pickle pledge, because people who are always whining look like they've been sucking on a dill pickle. People are bringing in pickle jars and they fine each other. If you're caught bitching, moaning, whining, complaining, the other BMW club, you're asked to put a quarter in a pickle jar. One day a guy came in and said, I know it's going to be a shitty day. Here's a buck. I'm paying in advance. We're seeing the most amazingly creative pickle jar decorations. I love this one. Isn't that what you want to do? The person who always whining and complaining, just stick a pacifier in their mouth and say, oh, poor baby. And this is my all-time favorite. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Complaining about problems never solved a problem. You got to have the courage to do something. Talking about somebody behind their back never helped that person be a better person. It takes courage to stop talking about somebody and actually go talk to that person. But those are the only conversations that matter. And when you make the pickle pledge a part of your organization, a part of your culture, a part of your own mindset, you stop whining, you stop complaining, you stop talking about people, and you start doing things about it. And you start seeing the things you can be thankful and grateful for. It's changed my life. It's changed the lives of a lot of other people. It will you too if you take it to heart. And we've actually launched a pickle challenge for charity where we'll challenge an organization to raise money by turning complaints into contributions. We have raised over $100,000 for different charities. The organization picks the charity. Methodist Hospital and Methodist Children's in San Antonio, they raised over $7,000 for the HCA Hope Fund. And that's being put to use now as Hurricane Laura blasted through Louisiana. HCA is helping to support some of their employees who were harmed by that hurricane with money from the HCA Hope Fund. If we could do this across the country, around the world, we would end the national debt. We'd also be a much more pleasant place to work, wouldn't we? And as I said, we've raised a lot of money for charities with the Pickle Challenge, and this is from our Pickle Pledge website. Now, why do people whine? Why do people complain? Because they have negative self-talk. I mean, anytime somebody's projecting negative thoughts out onto other people, that's what complaining is. They're projecting what's already going on up here. And this is, I do live polling when I do keynotes, and I've done thousands of people. This is a group of healthcare professionals that I did last year before COVID. And I asked people, what would you see if you could read my mind? And 7 out of 10 said they struggle with negative self-talk. Very, very few people said you almost never see it. I'm one of those down there where it's, being honest, it's a chaotic mess. And I struggle with it all day, every day. Most people do too. And what is negative self-talk? Telling yourself lies about yourself and believing the lies to be true. And then the lie becomes your reality and you talk yourself into it. And the most important speech we ever give is the one we've never been taught to give. You know, you can go to Dale Carnegie or join Toastmasters or take a class on public speaking, but who teaches us, what do you say when you talk to yourself? How do you talk back to yourself when you're beating yourself up and sabotaging yourself with negative self-talk? Nobody teaches us those things. And I guarantee if you got kids in school, they are not learning those things in school. Quite to the contrary, it's probably being made worse. What's the first word that every baby learns to say? No. Why? That's all they hear. No, don't touch that. No, put that down. No, don't play in the street. Don't play in the street is really good advice for a 4-year-old. But what happens is that primordial no, don't, metastasizes. That's what cancer does. It is still up there. Only no, don't play in the street becomes no, don't ask for the date. She might say no. No, don't start the business. You might fail. No, don't write the book. You might get rejected. And if you don't challenge that, if you don't talk back to it, you will put yourself in a self-confined little box that creates, you're looking in the mirror and seeing the tabby cat looking back at you. And it's been going on for so long, you're not even aware of it anymore. I mean, pay attention. Pay attention for an hour to what goes on up here. You will be appalled at how much of it is negative. And psychologists have shown empirically that that's the default mechanism. If you're not consciously structuring your thinking, it will automatically gravitate toward negative, frightening, and depressing thoughts. And it's like graffiti in the New York City subway. And it is not your inner child you're listening to, it's your inner spoiled brat telling you, don't go to school and get a PhD, watch TV instead. Don't go to the gym, eat a donut instead. And here's a key point. Negative self-talk, pay attention, you'll recognize what I'm telling you is true, is always and without exception in the second person. You will never hear that voice up there say, I'm not good enough, nobody likes me, I better not try that, I'll fail. It's always as if somebody else is talking to you. And why is that? Because in a very real sense, that is exactly what's happening. A long time ago, somebody said something to you, it hurt, it stuck, and it is still up there, echoing around. All negative self-talk is, it is a malignant echo of things you heard in the past. It is not the authentic, real you that wants to grow, that wants to ask, that wants to explore. No, it's that old voice saying, sit down, shut up, and don't try to be special. And how do you talk back to a disembodied voice? Well, one way you can do it is create a metaphor. A metaphor is a word picture, a very powerful form of communication, including how you communicate with yourself. And so we recommend a 3-step process we call the janitor in your attic. Step number 1, anytime you get negative self-talk, stop and visualize it for what it is. You got a little vandal up there, the memory, you might not even remember, but the memory is still up there of somebody who said something to you that hurt, that was painful, it stuck, it's still up there. And they're like a spray can graffiti artist. Go to Google Images, type in cartoon character graffiti spray can artist. That's how I found this guy. There are hundreds of them. Find one you like. Oh yeah, I can relate to this guy. Make it yours, visualize it, create as powerful a mental image as you can. And every time you hear negative self-talk, there he goes again, spray painting the attic up here with negative self-talk. Step number 2, you need to have a janitor to come in and repaint it, sweep it away. And again, go to Google Images, that's where I found all these, and pick one that works for you. I actually couldn't find one that reflected, I knew what my guy Spike looked like. I had a cartoonist draw it for me. And anytime I get negative self-talk, and I do like you do too, you'll never amount to a hill of beans. Why, your company's older than Salesforce, and they're a Fortune 100, why aren't you? I mean, I hear that crap all the time, I bet you do too. I go, hey, Spike is back up there again, paint it out, sweep it away, and then go to step number 3. Remember I said that negative self-talk is telling yourself lies about yourself and believing the lies. Positive self-talk is also telling yourself lies. By definition, affirmations aren't true. You wouldn't have to say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and everybody likes me if you didn't believe it. And if you're going to tell yourself lies anyway, why not make them good lies? There was a tennis pro named Gullickson who was notorious for choking on tiebreakers. And he hired a mental toughness coach who taught him to say to himself 25 times a day, Gullickson loves tiebreakers. At first it wasn't true. A couple of years later, he started to become an ace at winning tiebreakers. Why? He had changed the bad lie into a good lie, and then it became his reality. Now, I know some of you are thinking that's really silly, little cartoon characters up there, and I grant you it is. But I read this book, The Mind and the Brain, by Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. He's a neuropsychiatrist. And it was one of the first books to talk about neuroplasticity. That is the ability the human mind has to rewire itself in response to what happens to you, but also directed mental thought. I was so excited, I called him on the phone. We talked for about an hour. And I told him about this little game, The Janitor in Your Attic. And I asked him, if somebody made a good faith effort to transform graffiti into something positive, would you be able to detect physical changes in the wiring of their brain? He said, absolutely. And then he explained the science to me. And I'll tell you, after that, I got a whole lot more intimate with my guy, Spike, and a whole lot more emphatic at telling other people, if what you're doing now isn't working, and for at least 7 out of 10 of us, that it's not, why don't you try this? And then the third strategy is this. We live in a world that is trying to steal our attention. It's the biggest con job, the biggest heist in the history of the world. Everybody is trying to steal your attention away from you. Nicholas Carr wrote a book called The Shallows, as in the shallow end of the IQ pool, about what the internet is doing to our brains. That was 6 or 7 years ago. It's gotten a lot worse now with all of this social media stuff. Again, when I'm doing speaking, when I do keynotes, I'll ask people, what % of your effective work hours are devoted to your #1 priority? And almost nobody says it's more than an hour a day. And that's on a 12-hour day, not just the 8-hour workday. And where's the rest of it spent? Well, according to AC Nielsen, the average American spends 4 hours a day watching television. Depending on which study you look at, we spend another 3 to 6 hours a day online, on our cell phones. That's time that you can't work on getting a graduate degree. You can't be going to the gym. You can't be writing a book. You can't be spending time with friends and family. And how do you focus? This is a sign I have in my office at home. The one big yes requires lots of little no's. You want to write a book? You don't have 4 hours a day to watch television. You want to start a business? You don't have extra money to go shopping therapy when you're bored or depressed. And this simple tool, and this is a screensaver I often have, it's a DDQ, direction deflection question. Is what I'm about to do or say going to help me achieve an important goal? And infinitely adaptable. Is what I'm about to put in my mouth going to help me achieve my ideal body weight? Is what I'm about to spend my money on going to help me achieve my goal of being debt-free and financially independent? If you make this a personal habit to ask yourself this question, write it on the side of your hand, DDQ, every morning. So every time you see the hand reaching for the donut or the wallet or the TV knob, you stop and say, is what I'm about to do going to help me? And the answer will be no. Then you say, well, what would I do? It'll be harder than what you're about to do. If you can do that, you'll start losing weight, getting out of debt, getting your book written. And finally, I want to tell you about the Self-Empowerment Pledge. And again, it's in the handout that you all have. We have a course on the Values Trainer website. It's 21 10-minute video modules. You go through each promise 3 times. Do it with somebody else, and there's no cost for it. If you are waiting for somebody else to empower you, we hear this all the time, no one ever empowers me. You need to know that nobody can empower you but you. And as a manager, you know you cannot empower somebody who does not see his or herself as already being empowered. It's like trying to push a string up a wall. It comes right back down. But once you have become that self-empowered person, nobody can take that power away from you. It's an inside job. It's something you do for yourself. And so if you knew it would change your life in a positive, permanent, profound way, I'm about to ask you to make an investment here. Would you invest in yourself 1 minute a day for a year? Every day for a year, would you invest 1 minute? And if your answer is yes, here's what you do. Print out that Self-Empowerment Pledge. Make copies of it. It's in the handout I gave you. It's on the Pledge Power website. It's on the Values Trainer website. Make as many copies as you want. There's no charge for it. Share it with other people. And every morning you get up and you say that day's promise. And it'll take you about 15 seconds. So on Wednesday, you get up, look in the mirror, have it taped there on your mirror. Wednesday, today is determination. I will do the things I'm afraid to do, but which I know should be done. Sometimes this will mean asking for help to do that which I cannot do by myself. Do it again in the middle of your workday, out loud wherever you can. Do it with other people when you can. One more time right before you go home, and one more time right before you go to bed. 4 times 15 seconds a day, 1 minute a day to tell yourself these lies. Because when you say that, I will do the things I'm afraid to do, you'll hear the little voice in the back of your head say, like hell you will, you never do. You keep telling yourself that until you believe it. And I have had people tell me I could feel it like a light switch. The day those promises finally kicked in, I finally started changing my attitude. I finally stopped waiting for somebody else to give me permission to empower me. And I started making that personal commitment. And here's why it works. You know, why I say it will change your life, not can, might, could, or should. Every day you're promising yourself to be responsible, accountable, determined, positive, resilient. And every day you're going to catch yourself breaking those promises, whining, complaining, procrastinating, blaming other people. And you're going to get what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. This is a form of mental illness. This is trying to hold two incompatible beliefs at the same time. It's promising yourself to be an eagle and then being a chicken. And at one point, and again, you'll feel that light switch, one of two things has to happen. Either you take the easy way out and just stop making the promises. If you keep making the promises, you will begin to change your attitudes and your behaviors, and you'll shape new habits and behaviors. And as you do that, you're going to start achieving better results. You're going to start losing weight or getting out of debt or whatever your goal is. So what I'm going to challenge you to do is when you go home tonight, read those 7 promises. If you have family at home, read it to everybody and ask yourself these 2 questions. Question number 1, if I personally made a good faith effort to be more responsible, accountable, determined, etc., would I be better off a year or so from now? Number 2, if everybody where I work made a good faith effort, not just to make the promises themselves, but to help each other live those promises, would we do a better job as an organization? And the answer is going to be absolutely. One of the people in this picture was a drug addict, and his manager, Katie, obviously, the only woman in the picture, got her team together and said, every day we're going to do that day's promise. And Kyle, one of the 3 guys, said, I'm not doing it. This is silly. And she said, well, yes, you are. This is a team activity. You're a member of our team. You will do this. And if you don't want to be part of our team, then I'll get you on another team somewhere else. And every day under protest, he promised to be responsible and accountable and determined and positive, knowing that he was telling a lie because before the end of a shift, he was going to sneak into the medication room and steal narcotics for his own personal use because he's a drug addict. And finally, he said, I just couldn't live with myself. He went in, he talked to his boss. He admitted what he was doing. They sent him to a drug treatment program. And today he's in his 4th year of being clean and sober. And his story was written up in that book, Chicken Soup for the Nurse's Soul. Now, what are the odds that if his manager had not had the courage to say, yes, you will, had he not finally had the humility to say, yes, I need to, that instead of walking out every day with his wristband for that day's promise, he would have been dragged out in handcuffs or a body bag. And it's 100%. I mean, it wasn't a question of if he was going to get caught or die, it was when. This can be an incredibly powerful commitment that people make. In the handout that you have, there's a pledge partner agreement. When 2 people do it together as a group, we have found that's far more effective. And when people do it as a team, this is a hospital in Texas where every single morning people get together for their daily huddle and say the promise out loud as a group, then that makes it more powerful as well. So let me wrap up with this question. What does it mean to be a leader? You may have seen behind me this banner that says, proceed until apprehended, because leadership does not require a management title. Management is a job description. You got to have a name tag, a title. Leadership is a life decision. And you know some of the most effective leaders in your organization or in your community, they don't have a title. They weren't elected. They weren't appointed. They saw something that needed to be done and they did it. Management is what you do. Leadership is who you are. Leadership is by example more than any other single thing. Management expects compliance. We're going to crack the whip, hold your feet to the fire, hold you accountable. Leadership seeks commitment. We want you to be proud of what you do. We want you to take ownership so we don't have to crack the whip and hold your feet to the fire. Management is transactional. It's important to pay the bills, to get payroll done, to get customers in. Leadership is transformational. Management is about running the organization. Leadership is about changing people. And my definition of a leader is this. A leader is someone who helps you achieve goals you didn't know you could achieve by becoming the person you didn't realize you could be. by looking in the mirror and seeing that lion look back and then doing the work to be that person. That is the real leadership challenge. You do that and the culture will take care of itself. Thank you all very much for everything you do and for letting me be a part of your day. Please do the homework and please feel free to email me, joe@valuescoach.com, all one word, no hyphen, joe@valuescoach.com, if there's ever anything that I can do to help you and or the people you work with. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We will again take questions from the audience. Please either use the Q&A feature or click the raise your hand icon to ask a question. Looks like we got Joe on board here. How you doing, Joe?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Tim.
Awesome. That's just good stuff. I can never get enough of that. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to start out with a question. So how do you sustain a positive culture when everybody is working from home?
Well, you know, that's sort of the $1 million question today. Yeah, if I had a really easy answer, I'd be headed to Stockholm for my Nobel Prize. But I'd recommend a couple things. One is create a written document that is your statement of culture philosophy, your culture code. It was something pioneered by Netflix in California. In fact, the Netflix CEO, Reed Hastings, recently wrote a book about it called No Rules Rules, something like that. But to put in writing what you expect of people and what you want your culture to be, and then to make sure that everybody reads it. Second, I think having rituals is really important. You know, in my presentation, I mentioned the daily huddles, to make that more than just a business meeting, but to make it something that reinforces your culture. And, you know, now with Zoom or with Teams, we can do that virtually. It's not maybe as much fun, but it's probably more important. And I think the third thing is just stay in touch with people. Phone calls, Zoom calls. We need to be in touch with people more, not less, now that we can't actually do management by walking around. So those are a couple of things I would recommend.
Awesome. So how do you handle a situation where one of your top performers, you know, he's just one of them guys that drags everyone down, you know,
Yeah, we've all got one, most of us. The first thing I would do is redefine performance. You know, if your definition of performance is the guy makes lots of sales, brings in lots of money, but he's dragging everybody else down, is that really a top performer? The second thing is, at some point, immediately you need to have those courageous conversations and say, you know, this is just not acceptable. But at some point you have to make the decision, are we willing to honor our values and honor our culture and terminate this guy, even if there's a short-term financial penalty? Robert Sutton is a professor at Stanford University. He's written a number of books on leadership, one called The No Asshole Rule. And his research shows that when you finally do have the courage to get rid of that toxic emotional vampire, everybody else's performance comes up more than enough to offset any loss that you've sustained. But the most important thing is, if you say these are our values and you're looking the other way at somebody who abuses those values, what kind of a message are you sending to everybody else?
all right. So what do you think would be the biggest culture challenge for leaders that we'll face in the next year?
You mean other than COVID-19 and the recession and hurricanes and fires and the election coming up, other than those things?
Nothing new. Yeah.
I think it's going to be, you know, when the pandemic started, we were seeing a lot of, as I, in the presentation, you know, I talked about World War I, 1914 and 1918. Back in February, March, April, there was a lot of, we got this, and, you know, we're stronger together. Your community, especially in the healthcare world, was very supportive. Now, when I talk to healthcare leaders and I ask, what's your, and most of our work's healthcare, and I ask, what is your biggest concern? They say, I don't think we can sustain another spike like we've had. My people are exhausted, they're anxious, they're uncertain about the future. And I think the number one challenge is going to be protecting people from what's happening in the world outside, helping them deal with uncertainty, and frankly, preventing them from leaving. You know, we're hearing from a lot of people that people are thinking of retiring early because this has just gotten to be too much for them.
Yeah.
If they can afford to do that.
Is that, I mean, do you see COVID-19 impacting corporate culture, that kind of?
Absolutely. And I see it in two ways. I think you're sort of seeing this bifurcation that some organizations are going to come out much weaker as a result. And I think there will be some that are going to come out stronger. And some of the characteristics of the ones that are going to be stronger, loyalty to their people. You know, they're looking at layoffs as the last possible recourse, not the first. They're investing in culture. You know, if you're not willing to invest in protecting your culture in a crisis situation, you're going to end up with a culture you don't want to have when you come out of the crisis, if the crisis ever ends. You know, the CEO of one of the organizations we work with is telling his people, don't keep talking about the new normal. This is our normal, and it's going to be our normal for a long time.
Yeah, I think we have to find a way just to deal with it, because it's.
I think you're right. And, you know, COVID is not going to, I mean, herd immunity is not going to do it. The vaccine is probably a year or more away, even if they had something today, producing it, getting it out, you know, getting it past the anti-vaxxers. We're going to have to learn to deal with it. And I think one more thing that we as leaders need to do is create an expectation that that our people are going to practice the kind of health practices that the professionals tell us to do. You know, social distancing, wearing a face mask. You know, if someone comes to my door to work on my phone system and they're not wearing a face mask, well, I'm not going to let them in, for one thing. But to do our part to try to minimize the damage being caused by this pandemic is really important.
Okay, good. So what would be the first thing you would recommend anyone who viewed this presentation? What would, when they get back to the office, what would you have them do?
Make the self-empowerment pledge a part of your culture. Take it personally, give it to all your people, encourage them to do it. You know, maybe have a daily message going out. Okay, today is Tuesday. I want you all to think about personal accountability. That one method or technique, we've seen people make incredible personal changes, and we've seen organizations make some positive culture changes by making that a part of their routine. But you have to stick with it. You know, if you just do it for a couple of weeks, it's going to go away. If you stick with it, I mean, we have clients that have been doing it for 5 and 6 years now, and you walk into the place and people know the promises by heart. That's where it really makes a difference. So that'd be the first thing that I would have someone do. And it's in the handout that we sent with this presentation as a PDF.
Awesome. So always good stuff. It looks like that's all we have for questions. Thanks again, Joe, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And thank you guys for keeping us connected.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, see ya. Bye.
Up next, we have What's New, What's It Do? I want to start by thanking all the companies that submitted a What's New, What's It Do this year. We have 4 submissions that were selected by the Associate Member Group Committee for today's program. First up, we have AdTran with AdTran Mosaic Customer Experience, powered by Plume.
Hey, this is Brent Frederick with AdTran, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about our new Mosaic Customer Experience solution powered by Plume. And this is a new product as a result of AdTran's partnership with Plume, which gives us the ability to provide awesome Wi-Fi coverage to literally every one of your customers in your service area. It's very easy to use. It gives customers an awesome app that they can use to manage the Wi-Fi within their home, and it gives service providers a high level of visibility into troubleshooting customer Wi-Fi networks. But instead of telling you about it, let's take a look at how I've set up and used Plume in my house. So I received this box of Plume pods, a couple of them. Got a little plug-in, a couple of ports here. There's Daisy. She says that she just loves Plume. And then all we do is we take a cord, plug it into the remote gateway, plug this into the bottom of port 1, plug it in, wait a couple minutes, and it'll log up. So that Plume pod is going to pull up, and I labeled it Family Room, which I'll show you on our app. This is the second pod that I received, and I'm going to plug this in here. We're here in the kitchen, so I'm going to name that one Kitchen, and this one will adaptively connect over the air mesh to the other Plume pod, with the Plume pod in the other room, in the family room, acting as the remote gateway as well as a Wi-Fi access point, and this device acting as a mesh connected extension. So now I grab my phone, click on my Plume app, and I've got immediate view into my entire network. If I want to see who's connected to what pod, I've got the extension in the kitchen. Right now everyone's connected to the pod in family room. And I have all kinds of additional tools. One I like is I can click on each device and limit their internet access. Very helpful when you're trying to get kids to do homework. In any case, we've spent all our time, but I'd love to talk with you in more detail. So give me a call, send me an email, and be happy to tell you about AdTrend's Mosaic customer experience powered by Plume. Thank you.
Next, we have Fujitsu Network Communications with FlexHall M6424.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marty Shekel, Client Executive with Fujitsu Network Communications. As we meet here virtually today, the pandemic has brought into sharp relief the ongoing imperative to close the digital divide between rural and urban areas of the country. Along with fixed broadband, 5G will be a critical technology to support increased digital communications and ensure economic vitality for our rural operators and their communities. Today, we're highlighting Fujitsu's FlexiHall M6424 solution, an extremely versatile any-hall platform supporting growth in 4G networks in parallel with growing new 5G services. The M6424 is a converged platform supporting CPRI, eCPRI, and Ethernet services all in the same solution. And last but not least, it's a truly open platform that interoperates with any RAN vendor's equipment. Fujitsu can help you get ahead of the oncoming 5G transport curve, so please contact me for more. My name is Marty Shekel, and I approve this message.
Next, we have Nearby with Nearby Mobile Communications Platform.
Would your business benefit from improving communication? Introducing Nearby, the smarter way for mobile teams to communicate. Documenting, taking action, and unlocking new insights on anything associated with a specific location has never been easier. Whether your business is looking to identify timely sales opportunities and complementary services to drive customer growth and satisfaction, manage projects and the tasks associated with them to complete work on time and under budget, or document information in the field with absolute accuracy and efficiency to reduce operational costs while maximizing productivity, Nearby has you covered. Nearby's proprietary smart pin and location intelligence software empowers businesses of all sizes to improve performance and digitally transform outdated business processes in days. Driving new operational revenue, simplifying communication between mobile teams and contractors to maximize productivity, and providing real-time access to important information. Recently nominated Best Value in Location Intelligence Software by Capterra, businesses benefit from tremendous results with minimal investment. Affordable, simple to use and adopt, and results in days. Contact Nearby today and start reaping the benefits of a smarter way for your mobile teams to communicate.
Our final What's New, What's It Do is ProLabs with 100G QSFP28 ZR4.
Hi, my name is Ray Hagan. I'm the Global Product Line Manager for ProLabs. ProLabs is the market leader in third-party compatible optics. Today, we're here to speak about delivering 100 gig services beyond 40 kilometers. This is a challenge that's faced by service providers of all shapes and sizes, and it's only growing because of the growing bandwidth requirements of services such as wireless backhaul and distribution networks. This growth in these data services are requiring new cost-effective solutions to meet this market challenge. A new solution is here, QSFP28 100 gig ZR4 solution. And this is brought to market specifically to cost-effectively address this challenge of delivering 100 gigs up to 80 kilometers. It uses low-cost QSFP28 ports and makes 80 kilometers possible without amplification or dispersion compensation. So some of the applications in the network you'll find the QSFP28 ZR4 are for fiber to the business, if you're providing a service to the edge, and also from the network core, for potentially out to a PON OLT as those services are continuing to grow. And probably the bigger one we're seeing here is in 4G, 5G wireless networks. You're delivering from the wireless core out to a BBU, or perhaps to the midpoints in a new 5G architecture. 100 gig is going to be a big part of this story for 5G wireless. ProLabs is a global leader for third-party compatible optics. ProLabs is coming to market with a compatible solution with Cisco, Juniper, Nokia, Alcatel-Lucent, and more, leading OEMs. Please contact your ProLabs representative to learn more about the QSFP28 ZR4.
Thank you to our What's New, What's It Do presenters. I will conclude our general session today with some brief housekeeping items and reminders. Breakout sessions will be available for viewing online beginning this afternoon. An email with information regarding the password-protected breakout session videos will be sent to all registered attendees. Live Q&A for the breakout sessions will be next week. Those details will also be in the email sent this afternoon. The virtual exhibits are open from 2 to 4 this afternoon and again from 2 to 4 tomorrow afternoon. An email with the links to each of the virtual exhibits was sent to all registered attendees. There will be a second general session on Wednesday, October 14th at 10 o'clock a.m. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes the opening general session of the WSTA 2020 Virtual Fall Conference and Exhibits.